So thanks so much, everyone, for joining. My name is Sarah Nolet. I am a partner at AgThentic, and we spend 100% of our time thinking about innovation, adoption, and sustainability in the food and agriculture system. I am coming to you from Sydney, Australia today, but I definitely have an American accent, and I'm from the States originally. And you will see on this panel, we've got a few different geographies represented, as well as, importantly, a few different perspectives along the supply chain, chefs and front of house all the way through to producers, and definitely a couple of geographies as well. So really looking forward to the discussion today. This all wouldn't be possible without Maya Grazing offering to host this discussion and bringing us all together today. When the Maya team reached out, they talked about really an opportunity to educate around regenerative agriculture and talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities, some of the barriers, and what's exciting in this space. So hopefully we won't all agree on everything we say, and we'll highlight a few stories and dig into a few examples of what's happening globally in regenerative agriculture. We really want this discussion to be interactive. So if you have any questions, please jump in the Q&A and share any questions. And as people are already doing, put your name and who you are in the chat so we can all make a few connections here today. With that, I will start with a couple questions for our panelists. You guys all have access to the internet, so I won't waste too much time here today doing too many deep intros, because you can look up our amazing panelists as they talk and learn more about them online. And I know there were some linked profiles in the event that went out, but I'd love to start and maybe Meredith with you on how you first came to be interested in regenerative agriculture, maybe even hear about it, and what does it mean to you today, if it's different from when you first started looking at Regen?
Yeah, absolutely. So how I first got interested in it is kind of a bizarre way of going about things, but I was born and raised on my family's ranch, and so that's all I knew was just living in this beautiful environment. And I went off to the University of New Mexico and got my bachelor's and master's there. And I got my master's in landscape architecture with a focus on sustainability. And so there I really got to take the opportunity to really look at our land use patterns, both urban and rural environments, and kind of like suburban sprawl. And then basically almost like a disconnection that people were having in urban environments from nature and what nature actually meant to them. And so I got my master's. I spent 4 years really looking hard at our landscapes and our land use patterns. And I came back home to the ranch, and I just saw my dad's operation, his land that he'd been taking care of, with just a whole new appreciation for what he had been doing all these years. And of course, as the next generation, I had, some additions that I would like to make. And so it's me and my dad and our ranch manager, who's been with us since he was 18. He's over 50 now. And it's the three of us that manage 3,000 acres in north central Texas. So yeah, we're really, our goal is to ranch with the environment and habitat foremost in our minds, and really use cattle as a tool to manage the land and just find that rich symbiosis between ruminant animals and the grasslands that they co-evolved in. So it's pretty great.
Awesome. Meredith, when you first came back and started having those conversations with your dad, was it, did he already believe in this way of farming, or was it a bit of a different kind of thought process than what he had been doing, or how he thought about the world?
Well, he just saw it in a different way. So my dad's appreciation for habitat and wildlife was kind of what led him to the ranching style. And so that lends itself to a more regenerative approach of keeping the land intact and using what nature has to give you. And so, I always say that, like, Now with climate change, the issue of our time, my dad never said, back in the 70s or 40 years ago when he bought the land, he never said, oh my gosh, this is sequestering so much carbon. He just said, this is some good land that I could manage my cattle on. And so really it's been more of just making my dad aware of the good work that he's doing. And we've made some changes over time, but we just have a really rich discussions between each other, and it's just, we're rocking and rolling. So yeah.
Awesome, Meredith. And we'll get into some of those changes that you've made. Definitely something I want to talk about. Tanya, you're smiling and nodding. How did you first come across Regen, and has your view on it changed over that time?
Well, it's been a real eye-opener since I've moved to Australia 25 years ago from San Francisco Bay Area. And so, I mean, what we do at Straight to the Source is we take chefs and industry out to farmers like Meredith's dad and like your ranch, and it is eye-opening, and it continues to be so. And so, yeah, when you were talking, it's like what I love about what we do is being able to give chefs the opportunity to get an authentic understanding of exactly what that means and the value proposition to the ingredients that they're buying. But for me personally, following the food supply chain, it's something I've been interested in since I was like 8 years old, growing up in Oregon, So to be able to be in this, following the food chain and be part of the solution to education is just fantastic. And we never stop learning, we never stop learning, and to being part and playing a part in that is pretty awesome, really.
Great. Tanya, we'll definitely get back into some of those value proposition questions as well, because I think everyone's got a little bit of that on their mind. Lucy, how about you?
My experience of RegenAg has been through my career in the food and hospitality industry over the last 20 years. So I started working front of house and as a sommelier, and I had just a natural inquisitive nature as to what I was serving to people. I used to seek out those stories and want personally to understand the provenance of it, not really realizing until I owned my own businesses that a lot of people in our industry didn't necessarily have that same inquisitive nature and didn't seek out those stories. They just sort of took it for granted that what arrived on the back step of the kitchen in a styrofoam box was what they needed for the day, and that's what they cooked with, and that's what we served. It wasn't until I opened my own businesses in Sydney. I used to own and operate 3 award-winning restaurants, and I had a team of staff. And when I sort of just tried to work through what would inspire and engage them, I realized that a lot of those stories were the missing link. And it's something that people weren't being educated in, either through their apprenticeships, and front of house is often a job you come to not necessarily because it's been your career pathway. And I've been passionate about trying to change that as well, because our link between producers and consumers is to really be able to tell those stories and to bring that to life on the plate, and to engage consumers in understanding the provenance of what they're eating and consuming. And I think our knowledge over the past few years has only driven consumers and engagement in that. And it now comes from both a personal health interest, not only for themselves, for their children, for the planet, but also realizing that there's some very simple ways that they can reinforce and support RegenAg through their buying decisions. So that's how I came to it. I think reading The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan was a real light bulb moment for me, and that's what drove me to dig deeper. And so, as Tanya said, our whole focus now is to advocate for education in that space and just help people join the dots and make informed decisions about the food that they're sourcing and consuming.
Yeah, that kind of echoes a little bit of my personal journey into some of this. In that there was a moment I had spent a bunch of time in South America, living on a number of different large and small scale farms, and started getting really interested in sustainability and food. And we have a bit of a hobby farm at home. We mostly grow rocks and squirrels, so it's not particularly commercial. But always kind of cared about it, and had this moment at a grocery store. The first time back in the U.S., a massive grocery store, and I wanted to vote with my dollar. exactly as Lucy was just saying. And it's like, okay, well, this is grass fed, but is it grass finished? And oh, it has more packaging, but this one says non-GMO and this one says natural.
Yeah, it's like,
and this one, like your head just absolutely explodes. And I think the confusion can be the same on the producer side too, with all the certifications and projects and initiatives to get involved in. So we'll definitely dig into some of that. But Paul, Chef Paul, tell us about how you first came across Regen and if your views on it have changed.
A little bit different. Essentially, it was mad cow's disease, which got me interested in regenerative food practices. I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to, my career was sort of involved with mad cow's disease back in the UK in the 80s, where we saw almost overnight a whole livestock and way of eating change for the better. And you know, working in sort of luxury hotels in Mayfair, as you do, if you're up and coming chef, you're exposed, you're trained to sort of seek out the most exotic and the most expensive luxury items to be a good chef. And then, you know, BSE hit and mad cow disease, and we were all of a sudden obsessed with provenance and you know, sustainable farming. And I saw an opportunity to sort of, I suppose, create my own path and move away from cliches and predictable fine dining and sort of become more obsessed with produce and simplicity. Then moving to Australia was sort of further sort of enhanced that, because in Victoria, particularly, Australia's a big country. We have states which have the same climate all year round, so produce essentially stays the same. But in Victoria, we have this wonderful opportunity to cook seasonally, and would you believe, to cook seasonally was quite a kind of radical back in the day. You know, in the 80s, if you're a seasonal chef, you're quite cutting edge. You know, and certainly in Melbourne in the 90s, a lot of British chefs migrated to Melbourne, Australia, and they started cooking this beautiful seasonal food, simply, and produce first and supplier first and farm first and ingredient first, rather than menu speak and cliches and gobbledygook, which customers were obsessed with at the time. And we became stars, and we were quite humble, and we just wanted to pass it on to our suppliers and encourage them. And you have such a wonderful opportunity to connect with a farm or a supplier. You can actually, you know, grow your own food and create an impact on the restaurant scene. So you'd be mad not to embrace Regen if you're a thoughtful chef, in my opinion. So that's how I got started, and it really started my enthusiasm for good food and creativity outside of luxury ingredients and cliches. So I'm very thankful for the UK's sort of malpractice and how it's led me to Australia, and how it's made me an enthusiastic advocate for Regen. Yeah,
it's that whole episode has a number of kind of threads that have been pulled through in terms of Australia's integrity system for beef here, and a number of benefits that have come out of that, especially here in Australia. You mentioned a couple of threads here around this disconnect between consumers and producers, and I know the work with you guys, Lucy and Tanya, do. You're bringing people out to farms and actually, you know, bringing some of this experience and this disconnect to life. Do you guys have any good stories of kind of what that actually means? You know, we hear, especially from the producer side, how disconnected the consumer side can feel from the realities of production, and how expensive some of these investments can be, and how hard it can be. What's it like when you front of the house people or consumers or chefs show up on a farm and learn some of these realities?
Well, should I jump in here?
Yeah, great.
There's a couple of things that come to mind. You know, we were on a farm, it was a poultry farmer, and she has amazing ducks. And to see her face when there were 20 chefs coming to her farm that had made the trek, you know, flown in, drove for 3 hours, and were coming down her road, she was elated. You know, she wanted to share the story. She wanted to show, you know, their practices and their methods. And you know, I'll never forget her face. And that was overwhelming to us, because it was like, wow, this has given her an opportunity, and our chefs an opportunity to be there. So the other thing that comes to mind is we took 18 chefs. Imagine this, 18 chefs coming together on a plane, going to a region they've never been to. All 18 of them, none of them had met before. And we flew and we went on a 3-day adventure, and we went to farms and we went out to oyster leases, and it was just really amazing to have these guys together. But what we did in addition to that is we went to a commercial kitchen, and they walked in at 4 o'clock, and all we asked is that they brought their chef jackets and knives, and they cooked together. So we used the opportunity to take all this produce that we had collected over the 2 days, cooked meals for the community and the farmers, 75 of them. And fortunately, I had a good friend, Marty Bowitz, and he was the man directing, and the orchestra. But we all served these meals, and by 9 o'clock, we're in the bar high-fiving. But the farmers had never seen their food interpreted that way in their community, and and vice versa. We'd never had the opportunity to cook with all this produce together. So, those two stories just resonate because they're inspiring, they're educational, and they're just reinforcing that we need to shorten the divide between the consumer, and in this case it was the chef as the consumer. So yeah, there's a couple of stories. How about
I think also what's important about what we do, and we get a lot of farmers saying to us, oh, I don't know if you should bring them this week or that month because it's not going to be green, and I don't know. What we actually want to do is show people the real side of farming, not this rose-tinted idea of what agriculture is that I think a lot of people hold in their minds. So we want people to experience the real the real side of farming, and also understand the challenges farmers face in terms of weather, seasonality, production cycles. And what we've seen over and over again is that when these chefs and producers talk directly together, they can often solve really quickly some problems that have been real barriers for supply. And just that conversation starter is so invaluable both for the producer and for the chef. To give one other example. Do you have an
example of that, Lucy? I'm really curious about kind of solving problems. Like it does often seem like things are so far apart.
Yeah, so I think the whole movement in artisan cheese making, a lot of the barriers that they've faced over a number of years is the inconsistency in the product. And the reason for that inconsistency is the difference of spring milk versus summer milk versus, the different seasons and the effect that the grass the animals are eating have on that end product. So what we used to think of as faults, which is inconsistencies in flavor and texture, is actually what we want to encourage. But that's an education piece, both for chefs in the industry, and from there for those people to communicate to consumers that actually that is what they want to look for. Because now there's a real movement towards raw milk production in Australia. We've been a little bit behind on that, I think, on the world platform. But there's some very dynamic people in Australia working in the raw milk space, Pecora Dairy being one that comes to immediate mind. And that is the expression of provenance and pasture, and that is exactly what we need to be embracing. So the cheese that Pecora produced in spring in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales is going to be so different to what Paul would source in Victoria from a different dairy farmer, and that's what we've really got to be educating the industry and consumers to value.
Yeah, I like it. I think a lot. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
And I would sort of encourage graziers and farmers listening to really connect with, organisations which Lucy's part of, Straight to the Source and other, bodies like that, farmers markets and the like. Because in my opinion, you got to get rid of the middleman. The wholesaler is the enemy of, in my opinion, they're obsessed with profit and obsessed with representing themselves first. And you need to talk to the chef or the restaurateur or the journalist or the person at the farmer's market who's really stumping up and representing your produce to find out where you can connect and increase your yield and your interest in what you're doing as a farmer. Unfortunately, it's the food business for restaurants, the growth of restaurants and Uber Eats and the like, it's big business, and I used to be a fan of the wholesaler, but I don't even speak to them anymore. I just talk straight to the farm and to the fishermen, and that's you get the truth, and that's the only way forward for me.
Sorry.
You go ahead, Lucy.
I was just going to say, I think, Paul, what you're saying is absolutely right, but it takes time, doesn't it? And, you know, a lot of people in running their businesses just can't seem to find that time. So it's really reinforcing for them the reasons why they need to do that, why they need to actually take time to drive those conversations and connections with the producers directly, because it's easier to pick up a phone and just place an order, isn't it?
It certainly is, and you can't even do that anymore. You have to log on and enter a code, and you know, that's sort of how purchasing has become in the restaurant industry, sadly. But you know, we're not here to follow; we're here to create change, and I think that's something we all should always keep in front of us. That, you know, that's our mantra, is to be different.
One of the things that came up in a couple of those points was around the challenges on farm and kind of how difficult this can be. And you gave good examples of maybe consumers changing their mindset to accept different products. But a lot of this is also producers thinking about what changes make sense for them and evaluating those business cases and thinking about that. Meredith, I'm curious, you guys have done a few things on the farm, been involved in a couple initiatives around carbon and biodiversity and things like this. How have you thought about the kind of business case for making some of these changes?
Yeah, sure. So I have a couple of points to make, but I'll start with one of the things I'm most excited about is in the United States right now, there's a new nonprofit organization called the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. And it's a program dedicated to the marketing of other products that responsible ranchers have to offer the planet, such as carbon, water, and habitat, biodiversity. And so I'm really excited about this initiative because I feel like in the future, a rancher will not just have pounds of beef to sell, they will have tons of carbon sequestered, gallons of water purified, and acres of habitat preserved. And those will be part of their products that they will have to offer the planet. And then as time goes by, my goal with that is to get feedback from the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium in real time, so I can kind of see why I'm sequestering so much carbon. You know, what am I doing that I could do better to increase those numbers? But our initial results from this program was that we're sequestering a net sequestering. That's after you measure cattle belches and any inputs that we use. We're sequestering a net well over 2,000 tons of CO2 annually. So that's like taking 551 cars off of the road. And so, you know, my data was entered on a pasture by pasture basis. It was pretty grueling. I was the guinea pig for this, like for the pilot, for the rollout or whatever. But it's something that I just see in the future that will help on the financial side to help lessen the stress of risk from a rancher's point of view as far as an extra source of income. But also, you know, we're seeing increased climate variabilities. You know, right now on our property, we're experiencing some really terrible rain events. And by participating in things, practices that sequester carbon, you're building your soil bank, you're doing all of these things that in turn make your land more resilient to those climate events. And so it's kind of a double benefit thing, and that's something that I'm really excited about for all ranchers to take part of. It seems like a program that meets you where where you are at in your journey of ranching and these decisions that you're making. It helps you along to get even better. And so I'm really excited about that. Another thing that I'm excited about is in the US, we don't have a national traceability program. And so my beef goes through the traditional supply chain, and I don't know how my cattle, whose plate my cows end up on. And I think all of the work and effort and thought that I've put into the genetics and how I raise my cattle, I have no idea what the result of that is. And, you know, I think that's something that structurally needs to change, because I think if you give a consumer a choice between a ranch that has those environmental sensitivities such as ours, or someone that's not a priority whatsoever, I think the consumer would choose a rancher that's doing this with the environment at the foremost of their mind. And so I'm a board member of the Integrity Beef Alliance, and we're working on the first producer-developed sustainability program recognized by the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef in the nation. And that's kind of the way to bypass the traceability issue, by getting a bunch of cattle together that can represent the face of good stewardship, and then follow them through the supply chain to for people to know where their beef is coming from and that it's raised responsibly. And so those are two things that, you know, I'm trying on a very broad scale to overcome. And I think that it'll not only help a rancher's bottom line, but it will help them become more climate resilient to drought and flooding and invasive species and all of those issues that we're going to see more and more of.
I love that, Meredith, and really thinking about it, it sounds like as an investment, not necessarily just the kind of financial bottom line of how much payment you get for carbon in the next year, what the ROI is, but more of that kind of investment in resilience, it sounds like, which I think is really interesting and long-term thinking. There was a question in the chat there from Polly. Thanks for the question around how you might have navigated any resistance around a more traditional ag model, and any organizations that were supportive or provided support to you in going through that transition, or kind of fighting or responding to any resistance from a more traditional model?
I think, you know, and that brings up a good point, that I do need to be clear, in that I feel that I am a minority in wanting that national traceability model. And so the way I am approaching it at this point is to just lead by example. And so with, you know, for example, that sustainability program that we're developing at the Integrity Beef Alliance, other ranchers will hopefully be able to see that as an example, and be able to see the benefits and the good work that we're doing, and then want to be involved. So I guess in a way we're being the guinea pig, the example on, you know, whether this is a viable enterprise that others would like to engage in. For the most part, I've gotten a lot of support. The Noble Research Institute, the National Grazing Lands Coalition, the Foundation for Food and Ag Research, I mean, people are just so dang helpful. I really haven't gotten a lot of flack or anything. You know, we just try to approach the decision-making process together as a group, and have rich conversations, and try to troubleshoot those things, and just try to keep moving forward.
Yeah, great. Paul, when you were mentioning before about kind of getting into more regen ag and sourcing and thinking differently, or even seasonality, that maybe people looked a bit at you as the crazy uncle doing something completely different. Do you still feel that kind of regen and this type of thinking is kind of fringe, or is it becoming more mainstream, and is it becoming easier to navigate as well? Because you've got all these standards and different frameworks and certifications. You know, what do you look for, and is that space getting more complicated or less complicated?
Certainly less complicated. There's been a tremendous growth in awareness in regenerative farming in Melbourne in the last 10 years. I mean, Melbourne's very lucky. I can't speak for Australia, and I have travelled a little bit to Adelaide. Adelaide's quite similar to Melbourne. Because we grow so much of our own, we have our own markets. We have 4 markets in Melbourne, and people will go to a market as opposed to a supermarket to buy their food. And so they have that connection with, local producers, and who not necessarily are certified as organic or biodynamic, but they have those sort of practices embellished in what they do. And the media have got onto it because of the price difference, and they've sort of tried to sort of democratize it, I suppose. And what people realize, well, thanks to Netflix and other sort of powerful documentaries out there, it's not a healthy thing, well-being decision to eat organic or regenerative food. It's you're actually looking after the planet, and it's a holistic decision you're making. And also it's food. It's an important thing to sort of choose what you put in your mouth and what you give your family. And I think the social conscience has kicked in, and we're very lucky to have a lot of farmers markets here as well as supermarkets. So the markets have become quite laissez-faire, if you like, and the farmers markets are where we get the really good stuff, and we can get the real connection to the farmer and proper biodynamic and proper organic, and you should see the crowds at these farmers markets. And then there's these wonderful magazines and publications like Delicious Magazine, which is a very established food magazine, which to be established food magazine in Australia is quite an achievement, let me tell you, because the printing sort of organizations and media have gone through a cull because of IT, I suppose, and everyone's interested in buying magazines, and the like has diminished. But this one powerful magazine has made the Delicious Produce one of their sort of flagships, where they involve chefs, restaurants, and farmers, and create this award system. And it's amazing. And every year, as judges, we're forced, which is a wonderful thing to do, is to find new ingredients and new suppliers to nominate for these awards, and they get tremendous publicity. And it's in the national papers. So you must be living under a rock if you don't know how good our food is. And if you're not part of that, then you should be living under a rock, quite frankly.
We hosted a live panel discussion on regenerative agriculture recently, and I think the same phrase was used, that if you're not paying attention to regen, you're living under a rock. And I think someone else pushed back and said, if you think regen is going to save us all, then you're living under a rock. And so it's still a space that's some heated debate.
Can I just chime in on the Produce Awards for a minute? Thank you for bringing that up, Paul. So Paul, as he mentioned, is one of our esteemed judges on the panel. I'm actually the project manager of the Delicious Produce Awards. It's a role that I've held for 11 years now, and I've seen such an incredible increase in engagement from industry and consumers on food and food provenance. But what distinguishes the Delicious Produce Awards from other food awards is that our criteria and awards are not based purely on flavour, but how the food is produced is equally weighted. And I think that that's really an important distinction. I had a very long conversation with a RegenAg farmer recently, and just talking about how we've been taught to value certain things in food, and we aren't taught to actually recognise how the characteristics of food might be influenced by how they're produced. So, for example, the idea of a beautiful piece of beef is that your knife can cut through it like butter. Well, that's generally from a grain-fed type of production. It's not necessarily what you will see the characteristics of grass-fed beef. So we've got all these different sort of ideas of what the best quality food is, and I think we have to really change that conversation. It is obviously, we're looking for flavorful food, but we also want nutritious food, and we also want food that has been produced in a way that is benefiting everyone. And if you don't take those considerations in, then you're not necessarily eating. I guess people's distinction of what good food is changing, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I think the criteria around the produce awards is very important, because we have to look at both. You can't just look at flavor on the plate and that moment of taste for 2 seconds on your tongue, because that piece of beef might have taken 3 years to produce and nurture and process and reach your plate.
Are you seeing consumers and yeah, especially Tanya and Lucy, really change their understanding of what it takes to produce? Because I think a lot of the regen conversation, when we talk about it going mainstream, one struggle is we're still often talking about farmers markets and niche production and artisan, and especially in an Australian context, you know, a lot of producers are large scale commodity and maybe regen as well. And so is the conversation changing at all in terms of, you know, larger scale and more serious or non-artisan production, but still being regen? And do consumers care or understand that?
Go ahead.
I think they do. I think the conversation is definitely changing. I think people, and you know, documentaries like Kiss the Ground are certainly bringing people's awareness of, okay, I need to ask more questions. I need to have a better understanding. I think that the conversation is front of mind, especially because of COVID and what went before COVID in Australia, which was fires, drought, floods. And, you know, as Meredith said, these weather variabilities are only going to become more challenging. So it's a bigger conversation than just what am I putting in my mouth right now and am I enjoying it? It's bound up in so many different bigger conversations, and as all those dots are starting to connect for people, awareness is really being sparked. And Tanya and I have seen firsthand that when you witness these challenges and these production what goes into producing food firsthand, you start thinking very differently about that product that you're dealing with in the kitchen, because all of a sudden it has all these different, you've understood all the things that have gone into bringing it to be in your hands, and, you know, the respect you then want to show for that produce. And I think there's a lot of chefs getting on board with that and really trying to challenge themselves and their businesses and the people that they are accountable to for their food costs about how they can start changing what they're doing in their kitchens. I don't think it's going to change overnight, but the important thing is that if people are starting to think differently and can take small steps in that direction, then we're moving in the right direction.
I think it's important. It doesn't happen overnight. I think, you know, we're very get caught up in trends. You know, certainly in Australia we do, in the food industry, and you know, this is a long-term decision, isn't it? You know, choosing how you want to feed your family, or you know, how you want to eat. It's not, it should be something which is, you know, you're influenced by some sort of trend, you know. So I think to sort of encourage graziers, if you're thinking about making this decision, I think the longevity in this decision will pay off. You always have consistency, where if you're involved with something which is trendy, you know, and then, you know, then couple that with all the other challenges, then that's something I would urge you to avoid. You know, I think it's only going to get bigger, but it's not a quick road, but it's certainly the longest road and the best road.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think you've become a floating voice. There you are, you're back. I agree with that. I'm curious, and maybe this is what you're going to say, Tanya, on, you know, maybe we're oversimplifying, like sometimes this stuff costs more, and are people really willing to pay more? And I think for a producer, especially thinking about changing what they do or how they practice, like, show me the money is often the question. So yeah, how are people thinking about willingness to pay, or what are you seeing there?
Well, Paul was mentioning farmers markets, and I mean, I've been a farmers market rat since I lived in California, and then when I moved to Sydney and the market opened 23 years ago. I say that because we've been running farmers market tours for 16 years, and this is for like the public consumers as well as for chefs, right? So I've seen on these tours, like, you know, 5 or 6 people would sign up and they would come. Just last weekend, it was a junior foodie tour, and there's a waiting list. And it's because it's not necessarily the trend now. I've seen it over the years, how people are becoming much more educated. They're asking a lot more questions. They're buying perhaps less meat, but good quality. They care about the traceability and what they're feeding their family. And I think they've had enough of this big, commercialized food highway that runs up here. And I think, I have seen it, and I see it over and over again. And that's where the farmers markets, they're twofold, because the producer gets an opportunity. Yes, maybe they're not out on their property, but they're there, and they can actually spend that couple of minutes and really drive home their message. And then from the consumer, they walk away and they get back home and they unpack their bag, and there's a connection with that broccoli, with that beef, with that chicken, with that whatever. They don't have that when they go to Safeway or Kohl's or Woolworths or whatever, So I can see it every single Saturday at the farmers market, that people are excited to go. They're excited to spend their money and know that it's actually going to the producer, the farmer, the maker.
Yeah.
I think that correlates with the growth and interest in cooking at home as well. There's a tremendous growth in cooking at home or entertaining at home, as opposed to going out to a restaurant. And when you go to farmers market, you get exposed to the whole beast, so to speak. The nose to tail effect, and and there's a lot of more interested in that nose to tail sort of way of eating and slow food and the like. Not just sort of restaurant buzzwords. They're sort of household buzzwords now. And specific breeds. People want to know what breed it is. They understand. This beef's got more marbling because it's a belted Galloway. It's been 2 years on native grass. Because they've had a chat with the farmer. Then when they taste the beef from the farmer's market, from what they've had in the supermarket, they go, "This tastes like beef. This is how I remember beef tasting." So I think that's where the sort of opportunity is. It's just that creating that knowledge about what you do, keeping that conversation direct.
Exactly, Paul. Sarah, to answer your question though, we've seen producers that start out at farmers markets, right? And that's their way of introducing a new product to the market. But although they may scale up because they expand and they put in the infrastructure and they really can scale up, often they will still be present at a farmer's market because it keeps that connection to the consumer, whether it's industry or not. So can they maintain the integrity of their product and scale up? That's where they hit that sweet spot, and they've got to try to maintain that without losing the integrity.
The other thing we've seen a bit, and we run a program called Farmers to Founders, and we have a lot of producers come and want to do new value adding ideas and also technologies to get closer to consumers. And one of the things we're seeing is maybe you take 2% or 1% or 5% of your production and have an experiment that you're doing value adding. And so we've got a producer named Fiona, who large scale beef producer and lamb producer, and has started doing lamb sausage rolls. And it's just 1,000 of them, at the local cricket game or whatever, but it's starting those conversations with her local community and understanding what people want. And that set her off on a whole journey of thinking about a number of different changes, some of which aren't economical right now and some of which are starting to make sense, but just having that connection. So I think that's maybe one subtlety where it's not sort of all large scale or all artisan. There are maybe some hybrid programs or hybrid options to experiment a bit in this space.
And create another income stream as well, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. A bit of that resilience that a few of you have mentioned. Meredith, you've been nodding. I'm curious, what does your supply chain look like? You mentioned, is it mostly going through sort of off to a wholesaler, off to a processor? Or are you guys experimenting with any kind of connections to consumers or direct to consumer farmers markets, things like that?
Yeah, actually, so this is our first year experimenting, so we're brand new to this, but this past year we experimented with raising a pasture-raised steer, and we took it to the local butcher. They helped describe what they thought about the beef and the quality and the cuts and everything, and so we kept very detailed records of that, and we've sampled the meat. We've eaten all the tenderloins already. They're delicious. Very pleased with it. So basically, we know at this point, we know we have a really good product to sell straight to consumers. The issue now that we're facing really is kind of a USDA law regulation that, you know, we don't have the freezer space or facilities to be able to house all of the beef that we would like to sell directly to consumers. And, you know our neighboring ranches, one of the things that they've done is sell the beef before it even gets to the butcher shop. And so they sell it, and then the customer goes to the butcher shop and picks it up. And so we're looking at those various models, different pricing, but you know, everything you guys are talking about, like, I just have this deep longing for it. You know, just, I want people to smile and come back and say that beef was so good. And, you know, I want them to know the story behind it. My mom actually has a huge vegetable garden every year. And this year we just had an abundant crop of black-eyed peas. And, you know, we talk about appreciating your food. If we were snapping those peas and a black-eyed pea, you know, went across the room under the carpet, we would go and fish that black-eyed pea out and put it with the rest of them because it's just so special. And, you know, I really think that's something that's desperately lacking in the United States, especially, is just the valuing of food. You know, not just from a taste and freshness perspective, but from a cultural perspective, a story perspective. A family worked hard and put a lot of thought and energy into giving you those products. And so, you know, we are at the initial stages of working to direct sell our beef, and you know, so far so good.
Love it. Go ahead, Lucy.
I just wanted to add to that I think what's really important in trying to drive this, create change and drive change, is to be very aware that we need to make sure it's accessible to everybody, because I think there's a real danger that this conversation can be held in, you know, what a lot of people might consider elitist circles, you know, where people can afford it and they don't have to question, you know, the price of what they're buying. So I think there's a lot tied up in that. And I think that's got to be held front of mind. And that's something Tanya and I think about a lot, because, you know, Paul, I totally agree with what you were saying about chefs creating these connections directly with producers, but that's not possible for all chefs or all businesses. It's not possible for all families to buy some of these products that are probably too expensive for them to be able to feed the whole family on. So I think accessibility has to be front of mind for everyone in this space, and how that conversation about creating change is held, because it's important that everybody can be part of that conversation.
And that's an incredibly important point. I have a 6-year-old little boy, and he's at his first year in kindergarten here. And, you know, he eats the school lunches, and they're just not, I mean, my school lunches were kind of poor quality, and his have just really gotten worse. I'm like, how could it get worse? It's worse. But some type of a program that could even start at the younger age, like those really young kids in the elementary school, kind of where the farmers and the ranchers get together and are able to teach kids about food. You know, there's some bizarre foods. What do we do with a tomatillo? You know, what do we do with a skirt steak? You know, those types of things. I think if we instill that appreciation, that taste for fresh, healthy food in children at a very young age, they will grow up appreciating it and seeking it out.
Meredith, I couldn't agree with you more. And it is happening in like the early learning. You got to teach them young, right? So I'm the group executive chef of this early learning center group. There's 2 of them and they're building another one, and it's called the Orchard. So we have chickens and we have an orchard and we have a veggie patch and a snacking garden where they go out. But my job in that space is really to write the menus and hire the team, set them up so that they can do just that, like encourage creativity and really explain to the kids where their food comes from, because a lot of them, I mean, they'll have a piece of chicken and they can't correlate that that actually came from a chicken, or you know, globe artichoke, heaven forbid. How do you know what I mean? So just to demystify a lot of those things. But what's encouraging for me is it is happening. It's a small process, but there are businesses out there and organizations that are trying to achieve that. But it's a matter of the more the merrier. If more people get on the bandwagon, then you know. But yeah, that early learning children's space and
similarly old age care homes as well, you know, like they're just subjected to really, really terrible, woeful, unnutritional meals. My mother's in a nursing home, and it just fills me with such dismay what they feed them. It's really depressing.
You know what makes me really excited is the parents come to pick up the kids and they sit in the car park until little Johnny finishes their dinner or his dinner, because they know the food they're getting at the orchard is beautiful and amazing, and they'll just sit in their car and wait till they eat, because then they can take them home, bathe them. And you know, it's a double-edged, but I'd like for them to be having that at home, but it's a beautiful thing to have, to be able to be able to provide a meal like that. Yeah.
I love where this conversation has gone about a couple both local and kind of systemic examples of change that can be brought to bear to make RegenAg mainstream, which I think is both important, thinking about affordability and access, thinking about small scale production and large scale production, thinking about the business case and changes for the consumer and the farmer. We've just got a couple minutes left, and so I do want to do one quick whip round to everyone. If you've got any tips or advice for anyone listening. First one, for a farmer who's on this journey or thinking about getting more involved in RegenAg, what tips would you have? And for any consumers listening who maybe aren't farming, what advice would you have for them? So is it, visit a farm, or what tips would you have? Maybe Meredith, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I guess for the consumer, first of all, I would encourage just kind of what the bulk of the conversation has been about today, is to visit your farmers markets and try to buy as local as possible, and really try work your avenues to reconnect yourself with the food and the story behind it. As far as a producer goes, I guess something that I'm just would really like to bring home is that, all of us that are involved with such an important and precious task of not only taking care of our land for future generations and helping rebuild the planet, but we're also feeding people. Our job is their nutrition and their livelihood. It's an incredibly important job that we have. And so I just encourage us as a agricultural community to just really pat each other on the back and meet each other where we are in our journey, and just engage, reach out to each other, and build upon each other's works. And I feel like there's 100 different ways of going about your decision-making process on your ranch. And not one of them is going to be 110% right. So give yourself a break and give yourself some grace, and know that just you're in this process of improving your operation, as we all are. We're all on a journey together. And so just be encouraged. And, I just thank you guys for this talk today. It's been really great.
Thanks, Meredith. Paul.
I'm just running out of battery, so I'll keep it quick. I would encourage to think outside the square, and don't think, people aren't watching. Like, social media is a really obvious way. I found one of the best farms, biodynamic farms, transition farm in Melbourne, via social media. and Instagram, and tell your story, write blogs, take photographs, be proud. Don't ever think people aren't interested or not looking for what you do. There's a massive interest in what you're doing, and regenerative food is the way forward. And certainly as a chef and my colleagues, that's all we want to work with, and that will filter through the industry for years. And you're making the right choices. But yeah, simple marketing I suggest, and branding is very important too. People love brands. People are obsessed with brands. So create your own brand and be proud of it.
Thanks so much, Paul. Tanya.
I would just reiterate what Meredith and Paul have said, but connection, if you're a rancher or farmer, connect with like-minded, farmers and educate each other in that way. And if you're a consumer, it's the same thing. Get on social media, you'll find your tribe, you'll find the people that, inspire you, and you can share information. And the same for chefs, and industry, front of house, back of house. I mean, we're all connected. We're all connected in this world. So that would be my advice.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Lucy.
For chefs, industry and consumers, I would say ask lots of questions and make informed decisions. For producers, I think find ways to connect with your consumers and tell your story. I think, Paul, you're absolutely right. Brand is key in that respect, because people therefore can have confidence in what they're investing in and buying. I mean, ultimately, Tanya and I are absolute advocates for educating people in this space about food production, and food provenance, because ultimately we're all custodians of our planet. Our buying decisions have impact and can make change. And so any way that we can help connect those dots and help people make those informed decisions is at the heart of what we do. Fantastic.
And I was just rethinking something I said when I said a farmer's market rat. It's that saying, like a mall rat, like you're there. I'm an advocate or whatever you want to say, but I'm thinking, I don't know if everybody's going to get that term, and I don't mean like a real rat, but somebody that's been there from the first time I went to a farmer's market in California. When I was
We're all about food safety. Don't worry. We didn't take it the wrong way. No, thank you guys so much. This is a really great discussion. Thanks to everyone who's been listening. And hopefully there were a couple takeaways, meet people where they are. I think that's true, whether you're developing technology, adopting technology, developing standards, adopting standards, knowing that this is a journey and starting small, whether that's a % of your production or a % of what you buy or a % of what you eat. And I also like the point of kind of thinking systemically, and there's lots of big changes to be made, but maybe acting locally. There's things that we can do every day. So thank you guys so much for joining, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Cheers. And thanks Maya Grazing for hosting. Been fantastic.